There was a smell that came from a frozen breakfast tray that no restaurant ever matched. Not quite eggs from a skillet, not quite sausage from a griddle, something in between, warm and specific and unmistakable. The smell of a morning that someone had already taken care of for you. At its peak through the 1980s, Swanson's Hungry-Man Breakfast sat in the freezer cases of supermarkets from Maine to California. It fed factory workers out the door before sunrise. It fed latchkey kids who learned to read the tray instructions before they learned long division. It fed working mothers who had 30 minutes between waking up and getting everyone out the door, and 0 minutes to stand at a stove. Then one week, the shelf space was filled with something else. No announcement, no farewell. Just a different box where the red and white one used to be. How does a breakfast that fed a generation of working American families simply disappear from the freezer aisle without a single word of goodbye? This is that story. And for anyone who ever pulled that tray from the freezer on a cold weekday morning, it is a story that was never properly told. The American frozen food industry was built on a problem nobody wanted to admit existed. In the years after World War II, the United States was feeding itself differently. Women who had worked factory jobs during the war were being pushed back into domestic roles. But the economy kept pulling them out again. Families were moving to suburbs. Commutes got longer. The gap between when a family needed to eat and when anyone had time to cook kept widening every year through the late 1940s and into the 1950s. Someone was going to fill that gap. The question was who? The answer came from Omaha, Nebraska. C.A. Swanson and Sons had been in the food business since 1899, built on poultry and canned goods. A regional operation that understood the American appetite in a plain-spoken, practical way. In 1953, the company was sitting on 260 tons of unsold Thanksgiving turkey, refrigerated railroad cars full of it, circling the country because there was nowhere to put it. A Swanson salesman named Jerry Thomas is widely credited with the idea that solved the problem. Portion the turkey onto an aluminum tray alongside sweet potatoes and peas, freeze the whole thing, and sell it as a complete meal that any household could heat in a conventional oven in 25 minutes. The TV dinner was born in 1954. It sold 10 million units in its first year. Campbell Soup Company recognized what Swanson had built and acquired the brand in 1955. What had started as a solution to surplus turkey was now the foundation of an entirely new category of American eating, one that Campbell understood had no ceiling. Frozen meals were not a convenience. They were a cultural shift. The American household was reorganizing itself around speed, and Swanson had arrived exactly on time. For nearly 2 decades, Swanson dominated the frozen meal aisle with dinners: chicken, turkey, beef, fish. The full architecture of the American plate, frozen and stacked in supermarket cases from coast to coast. But by the early 1970s, something was becoming clear inside the Swanson product development teams working under Campbell's oversight. The original TV dinner format had a problem. It was too small, not for everyone, but for the working men who were Swanson's most consistent buyers. The factory workers, the construction crews, the truck drivers, the men who spent 8 to 10 hours doing physical labor and came home needing a real meal. The standard frozen dinner was closer to an appetizer than a solution. Swanson's own sales data and consumer research pointed in the same direction. There was an underserved customer standing in the frozen food aisle, picking up the standard tray, putting it back down, and walking away. In 1973, Swanson answered him directly. The Hungry Man line launched with a simple, unambiguous premise: larger portions, more protein, and no apology for either. The name said everything the marketing team needed to say. This was not a diet meal. This was not a light option. This was food for a man who had worked hard and was hungry, and who deserved a dinner that acknowledged that fact without embarrassment. The original Hungry Man dinners ran roughly a third larger than standard Swanson trays, priced to reflect the difference, and positioned on shelves with packaging bold enough to be found from 10 feet away. The line was an immediate success, which created a new question inside the Swanson development teams. If Hungry Man worked for dinner, what about breakfast? The logic was straightforward. By the late 1970s, the frozen breakfast category was beginning to develop. Eggo waffles had been on the market since 1953, and a handful of other frozen breakfast items had found shelf space. But no one had applied the Hungry Man philosophy to the morning meal. The existing frozen breakfast options were small, light, and aimed at children or at households looking for a quick add-on to a larger morning. Nobody had looked at the breakfast aisle and asked the same question as Swanson had asked about dinner in 1973. What does the person who actually needs to eat want to find here? The answer, when the Swanson product team worked through it, was not complicated. It was eggs, real scrambled eggs, not a token portion. It was breakfast meat, sausage links or bacon with enough presence to matter. And it was a starch that could hold up through freezing and microwave preparation. Pancakes, French toast, hash browns, biscuits, something that completed the plate and made the meal feel like a meal rather than a snack with protein. The Swanson Hungry-Man Breakfast was built around one core belief, that a working American deserved a hot, complete, filling breakfast even on the mornings when nobody had time to cook one. That belief was not complicated, it was not revolutionary. But in the frozen breakfast aisle of the late 1970s and early 1980s, it was new enough to matter, and the people who built it understood, in the way that the best product developers always understand, that they were not just making food, they were solving a morning. The freezer aisle of an American supermarket in 1983 was a different place than it is today. The cases ran longer. The doors fogged when you opened them. The cold hit you in the face even before your hand touched the handle. And somewhere in that case, usually at eye level, usually near the center where the traffic was heaviest, sat the Swanson Hungry-Man Breakfast. The box was red and white, the lettering was bold and direct, and the portion size was visible even through the packaging. This was not a small meal. Everyone in the aisle could see that from a distance. The major chains carried it. Kroger stocked it in the Midwest and Southeast. Safeway ran it on the West Coast and in the Mountain States. A&P had it on shelves across the Northeast. Winn-Dixie moved it through the South. For a family doing the weekly grocery run at any of these stores through the first half of the 1980s, the Swanson Hungry-Man Breakfast was simply part of the freezer section. As expected as the orange juice and as reliable as the butter. It was one of those products that shoppers stopped consciously choosing after a while. The hand just went to it. What made it work was not novelty. It was dependability. The scrambled eggs held their texture better than most frozen eggs had any right to. The sausage links, dense, seasoned, with that particular snap that came from the casing tightening in the microwave, were the kind of sausage that felt like a decision rather than a garnish. The pancakes absorbed just enough steam during cooking to come out soft in the center without collapsing entirely. The hash browns crisped on the edges if you let the tray sit for the recommended time after the microwave stopped. Every element of the tray had been engineered to work together, and on most mornings in most microwaves across most of America, it did. The people who bought it were not all the same. That was the thing that made the Hungry Man Breakfast different from how it was marketed. The advertising leaned toward men, toward the working class appetite, the guy who needed fuel before a physical day. And that customer was real. He existed in enormous numbers, and he bought the product consistently. But the freezer case told a more complicated story. Mothers bought it for teenagers who woke up after the rest of the family had already left for school and work. Women living alone bought it because it delivered a hot breakfast without the math of cooking for one. Families with irregular schedules, shift workers, nurses, truck drivers, anyone whose morning did not follow a standard clock, stocked it not as a treat but as infrastructure. The Swanson Hungry-Man Breakfast was whatever the household needed it to be. A fallback, a staple, a reliable answer to the question of what to eat when nobody had time to ask the question. The ritual of it mattered too. There was a specific sequence to preparing a Hungry Man breakfast that anyone who grew up with it in the house can still reconstruct from memory. You pulled the box from the freezer, you read the instructions on the side panel, even if you had read them 50 times before. You peeled back the outer film on the indicated sections and left others covered according to the diagram. You set the microwave. 2 minutes, rotate 2 more minutes, let it stand. That standing time was not optional. The tray was hot enough to burn through a dish towel. You carried it to the table, or to the counter, or to the couch in front of the television, and the smell that came off it when you broke the remaining film was dense and particular. Not quite like anything cooked from scratch, but not inferior to it either. Just different, just its own thing. That smell was the product's most loyal salesman. It traveled. It moved through the house before the microwave finished. It reached the bedroom of a kid who had not planned on getting up yet and made a case for consciousness that was difficult to argue with. Adults who had eaten Swanson Hungry-Man breakfast as children in the 1980s report the smell as the most persistent memory, more vivid than the taste, more specific than the packaging, more reliable than any advertisement. By the mid-1980s, Swanson had embedded the Hungry-Man breakfast into the architecture of the American working week. It was in the freezer the way the coffee was on the shelf. Not exotic, not special occasion, just present. A whole generation of American children was growing up with it as a background constant of domestic life. Their parents had stocked it because it worked. The children learned the microwave instructions because they had to. And somewhere in that repetition, in the peeling of the film, and the standing time, and the smell that moved through the house, something lodged itself in memory that no later product would ever fully dislodge. What was it about that tray, that specific smell of sausage and eggs on a cold weekday morning, that made it feel like someone had already thought about what you needed before you were awake enough to think about it yourself? The answer was simpler than anyone in a corporate boardroom would have predicted. It was not the ingredients, it was not the price, it was not even the portion size, though that mattered. It was the reliability. In a decade when American working families were stretched in every direction, longer commutes, two-income households, children managing more of their own daily lives than any previous generation, the Swanson Hungry-Man breakfast was one of the things that did not require negotiation. It was there. It worked. It was enough. And for a significant portion of the American population, moving through the 1980s at a speed that left very little room for breakfast to be a problem, that was not a small thing. That was everything. By the mid-1980s, Swanson was not simply selling frozen breakfasts. It was operating a logistics machine that stretched from production lines in the Midwest to freezer cases in nearly every major supermarket chain in the country. And the scale of that machine was both the brand's greatest achievement and the first quiet source of its vulnerability. The national rollout of the Hungry-Man breakfast had not happened overnight. It had been built chain by chain, region by region, through the kind of ground-level sales work that defines how food brands actually move through the American retail system. Swanson's regional sales teams negotiated shelf placement with grocery buyers who had limited freezer real estate and no obligation to make room for a new SKU unless the numbers justified it. The Hungry Man dinner line had already established credibility with those buyers. The breakfast extension carried that credibility into a new day part, and the buyers, by and large, made room. Kroger took it into its Midwestern and Southeastern divisions. Safeway positioned it in stores across the West Coast and Mountain States. A&P moved it through the Northeast corridor. Winn-Dixie distributed it across the South. By the early to mid-1980s, the Swanson Hungry-Man breakfast had achieved something that most frozen food products never reach: genuine national footprint, with consistent placement at eye level in the freezer cases where purchasing decisions actually get made. The freezer case real estate battle of the 1980s was more competitive than most shoppers ever understood. Every foot of freezer space in a supermarket was assigned, negotiated, and defended. Brands paid slotting fees to get in. They paid more to stay at eye level. They competed not just against each other's products, but against the supermarket's own private label offerings, which carried higher margins for the retailer and were increasingly capable of mimicking the appearance of national brands. In the frozen breakfast category specifically, Swanson Hungry-Man was competing for space against Banquet, against the emerging Jimmy Dean line, against store-brand scrambled egg tray that cost 30 cents less and sat on the shelf directly beside it. Swanson held its position because it had something the competitors did not: the Hungry Man name, which by the mid-1980s carried genuine consumer recognition, built over a decade of dinner line advertising. Shoppers who had never consciously followed frozen food marketing still recognized the red and white packaging and the bold lettering. That recognition translated to velocity, the retail metric that measures how quickly a product sells through. And velocity was what kept the Swanson Hungry-Man Breakfast at eye level instead of being pushed to the bottom shelf to make room for something newer. The production side of that success, however, was creating pressures that were less visible from the outside. Scaling a frozen breakfast to national volume is a different engineering challenge than scaling a frozen dinner. Eggs are among the most technically difficult ingredients in frozen food manufacturing. The proteins in scrambled eggs continue to change structure during freezing and reheating in ways that are difficult to control at high production volumes. What works in a test kitchen at 200 trays per hour does not always translate to a production line running 10,000. Swanson's food scientists and production engineers had solved these problems well enough to get the product to market and keep it there. But the solution required specific ingredient specifications, specific freezing protocols, and specific microwave instructions that left very little margin for variation. That rigidity was manageable when the production process was stable. It became a liability the moment any variable changed. Through the late 1980s, several variables began to change simultaneously. Input costs for breakfast proteins, sausage, bacon, were subject to commodity price fluctuations that were largely outside Swanson's control. Packaging material costs were rising, and Campbell's Soup Company, which had been watching the frozen food category with increasing attention from its headquarters in Camden, New Jersey, was beginning to ask the questions that large parent companies ask when a product line's growth rate starts to flatten. Where is the margin, and how do we improve it? The answers to those questions rarely lead to better ingredients. There is no single documented moment when the Swanson Hungry-Man breakfast formula changed. What the historical record shows, and what the pattern of consumer memory strongly suggests, is that the product of 1988 was not quite the same product as the product of 1982. The portion weights shifted in ways too small to appear on labeling, but large enough to register with regular buyers. The sausage seasoning profile changed in ways that longtime customers noticed without being able to articulate precisely. The egg texture, that specific quality that had made the product work when it launched, became slightly less consistent across production runs. None of these changes were announced. None of them were dramatic enough to generate a complaint campaign or a news story. They were the kind of incremental adjustments that get made inside large food manufacturing operations when cost targets need to be met. And they were made under the reasonable corporate assumption that most consumers would not notice or would not care enough to change their behavior if they did. Most consumers did not notice right away, but some did. And in the freezer aisle, where habit drives the majority of purchasing decisions, the moment a loyal customer pauses and thinks, even briefly, before reaching for the product they always reach for automatically, something has already been lost that is very difficult to recover. The machine was still running at full speed. The numbers still looked acceptable from the executive floor in Camden, but the product that had earned its place in the American freezer through genuine quality had begun, quietly and without announcement, to trade on the memory of what it used to be rather than the reality of what it currently was. That is a trade a brand can only make for so long. There is a particular kind of product that stops being a choice and becomes a constant. Not a luxury, not a treat, not something a household deliberates over in the aisle, just a thing that is always there, in the freezer, in the pantry, in the back of the cabinet, because it has always been there, because it works, and because the family that buys it has stopped imagining the alternative. The Swanson Hungry-Man Breakfast reached that status for a significant cross-section of American working households somewhere in the middle of the 1980s. It was not celebrated. It was not discussed. It was simply present. The way reliable things are present, the way the things that hold a household together tend to be invisible until they are gone. By the mid-1980s, Swanson's Hungry-Man line had become one of the best recognized frozen food brands in the United States. The dinner line alone had spent more than a decade building household familiarity through consistent shelf presence and advertising that spoke directly to its core customer without condescension or ambiguity. The breakfast extension had ridden that familiarity into the freezer case and had earned its own loyalty on top of it. not through a single breakout cultural moment, but through the accumulation of millions of ordinary mornings in which the product had done exactly what it promised and nothing more. The television advertising that supported Swanson and the Hungry Man line during this period was built around a tone that matched the product's positioning precisely. It was direct. It was unironic. It showed food that looked like the food in the box, served to people who looked like the people buying it. The Hungry Man campaigns of the late 1970s and 1980s leaned into the large portion identity without apology. The language was frank, the imagery was straightforward, and the implicit message was one that the working-class American consumer understood and responded to. This product respects your appetite, your time, and your intelligence. No one was being sold a lifestyle. They were being shown a breakfast. That directness was rarer than it sounds. The frozen food category through the 1980s was increasingly crowded with products marketed through aspirational imagery, meals that promised restaurant quality, gourmet ingredients, cuisine that transcended the freezer aisle. Swanson's Hungry Man sat in deliberate contrast to all of it. It did not promise gourmet. It promised enough. And for the households that needed enough more than they needed gourmet, that promise had compounding value every single week. The generational transmission of the product during this period is one of the most consistent threads in the consumer memory record. Parents who had grown up with Swanson TV dinners in the 1960s were now the adults running households in the 1980s. They had grown up with the brand as a background presence in their own childhoods. The aluminum tray, the divided sections, the specific ritual of the oven timer, and they carried that familiarity into their own grocery runs without examining it. When the Hungry Man breakfast appeared in the freezer case as a natural extension of a brand they already trusted, they put it in the cart with the same unthinking confidence they brought to any household staple. Their children grew up with it in the same unexamined way. The brand was replicating itself across generations, not through marketing, but through habit. And habit is the most durable form of loyalty in the consumer packaged goods business. How long can something be so deeply woven into the daily life of a working family that its disappearance seems genuinely impossible? Until the morning it is simply not there. For the people working inside the Swanson operation during the brand's peak years, the sense of stability was real and earned. The sales teams that had placed the product in Kroger and Safeway, and Winn-Dixie and A&P had watched it hold its position through the normal competitive pressures of the frozen food aisle. The production lines were running. The reorders were consistent. The brand had achieved the particular kind of market presence that looks from the inside like permanence. What was harder to see from inside that stability was what was moving in the broader market around it. McDonald's had launched the Egg McMuffin nationally in 1975, and through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, fast food breakfast had been quietly building a category that did not exist before. By 1987, McDonald's breakfast represented roughly 25% of the chain's total sales, a number that had required years of consumer habit building to reach, but that once reached, reflected a fundamental shift in where the American working adult was sourcing the morning meal. Burger King, Hardee's, and Jack in the Box had all followed McDonald's into breakfast by the mid-1980s. The result was a competitive landscape that Swanson had no direct answer to. Not because the Hungry Man breakfast was inferior, but because it required a freezer, a microwave, and a home to eat it in, while fast food breakfast required only a drive-through window and 3 minutes between the house and the highway. The factory workers still bought it. The shift workers still stocked it. The households where someone was home in the morning still reached for it. But a portion of Swanson's potential customer base, the commuters, the early office workers, the people whose mornings had become too compressed for even a microwave, was being absorbed into the fast food breakfast ecosystem, one drive-through visit at a time. None of this was visible from the freezer case. The product was still selling. The shelf space was still held. The red and white box was still there every week when the regular buyers came through. But the ground beneath it had begun to shift, and the people who would need to respond to that shift were not watching the drive-through lines. They were watching the quarterly reports, and the quarterly reports for the moment still looked fine. The first thing that changes is never the thing anyone is watching. In 1985, the Center for Science and the Public Interest published findings on the fat and sodium content of frozen meals that received significant coverage in American newspapers. The report was not aimed specifically at Swanson or at the Hungry-Man line. It swept across the entire frozen food category. But the Hungry-Man Breakfast, with its sausage and scrambled eggs and starch-heavy sides, was precisely the kind of product that landed at the wrong end of every metric the report highlighted: fat content, sodium content, calories per serving. The Hungry Man Breakfast was not designed to perform well on any of those measures because it had not been designed with those measures in mind. It had been designed to feed someone who was hungry, and it did that well. And for a decade, that had been enough. It was beginning to be less enough. The health messaging of the mid to late 1980s was not a fringe movement. It was moving into mainstream American consumer culture through multiple channels simultaneously. Newspaper health sections, television news segments, the American Heart Association's increasingly visible public campaigns, and a growing shelf presence in supermarkets of products explicitly marketed as low-fat or reduced sodium alternatives. The frozen food category was not exempt from this pressure. If anything, it was a primary target because frozen meals were easy to quantify, easy to criticize, and easy to replace with something that carried a health claim on the front of the box. Swanson's response to this pressure was the same response that most large food brands made in the same period: cautious, incremental, and ultimately insufficient. The company reformulated certain products in the broader Swanson line to reduce sodium or fat content. It introduced lighter options under the Swanson brand to capture the health-conscious segment of the market. But the Hungry Man Breakfast existed in a structural tension with every one of those moves. The product's identity was built on size and substance, on the explicit promise that this was a meal that would actually satisfy a real appetite. Reducing the portion, cutting the fat, or reformulating the sausage to meet a health target would mean changing the thing that made the product worth buying in the first place. The people inside the Swanson development teams understood this tension. The people in the Campbell Soup financial offices understood a different tension, the one between a product's identity and its margin. And in large conglomerate food companies, the financial offices tend to win that argument over time. The cost-cutting adjustments came gradually, and they came in the places least likely to generate immediate consumer backlash. Portion weights were adjusted within the tolerances permitted by labeling regulations, small enough reductions that the change would not trigger a required update to the front-of-box weight declaration, but cumulatively significant enough to affect the eating experience. The sausage formulation shifted toward a higher filler ratio, a standard industry cost reduction technique that changes the texture and flavor profile of breakfast meat in ways that regular consumers register as a vague wrongness without being able to identify the specific cause. The egg portion, which was the most expensive and technically demanding component of the tray, was the subject of ongoing internal pressure to reduce volume or substitute a portion of whole egg with egg product, which cost less and performed adequately in high-speed production environments. How long can a company keep adjusting what people love before the people who love it start to feel the distance? The shopper who had been buying the Swanson Hungry-Man Breakfast every week since 1982 did not receive a memo about any of these changes. She did not see a press release. She did not notice a label update. What she noticed, if she noticed at all, and many loyal customers noticed before they could say why, was a faint sense that the product was not quite delivering what it used to deliver. The sausage felt slightly less substantial. The eggs seemed to have less presence on the tray. The overall experience of the meal, which had once felt like a genuine answer to a real appetite, began to feel like a near miss, close enough to the original that the habit continued, but different enough that the satisfaction was no longer automatic. This is the specific way that food brands lose their customers without ever losing a single complaint. The customer does not call the company. The customer does not write a letter. The customer stands in the freezer aisle one week, reaches for the red and white box out of habit, and then, for the first time in years, pauses, looks at the box next to it, considers, Maybe puts the hungry man back and tries something else. Just this once. Maybe buys it anyway but feels afterward slightly less certain than before. That pause is the beginning of the end. It does not look like a crisis from the outside. It looks like normal variation in consumer behavior. The velocity numbers dip slightly and then stabilize. The reorder rates remain consistent. The shelf space holds. Everything appears from the quarterly report to be fine. But the habit has been interrupted. An interrupted habit in the consumer packaged goods business is almost never fully restored. In the freezer aisle of an American supermarket in 1988, the Swanson Hungry-Man Breakfast was still there. The box was still red and white. The lettering was still bold. The product was still moving. What had changed was invisible to everyone except the people who ate it every week, and to the executives at Campbell Soup headquarters in Camden, New Jersey, who were looking at the frozen food division and beginning to ask a question that would prove far more dangerous than any health report or competitor product ever could. They were asking whether they wanted to be in this business at all. The decision that ended the Swanson Hungry-Man Breakfast was not made in a factory. It was not made by a food scientist or a sales rep or a grocery buyer who had watched the product move through the freezer case for 15 years. It was made in a series of boardrooms by people whose primary relationship with the product was a line in a spreadsheet. And it was made with a logic that was entirely coherent from a corporate standpoint and entirely devastating from the standpoint of everyone who had ever depended on what that red and white box delivered on a cold weekday morning. By the late 1980s, Campbell Soup Company was under pressure. The company had spent decades building one of the most recognized food brand portfolios in the United States. But the frozen food division had become a source of increasing strategic discomfort. The margins in frozen meals were thinner than in Campbell's core soup business. The category required expensive cold chain logistics, refrigerated trucks, freezer case maintenance, temperature-controlled warehousing, that added cost at every point in the supply chain. And the competitive landscape had intensified significantly. Stouffer's, Banquet, and the emerging Healthy Choice line from Conagra were all fighting for the same freezer space. And the private label frozen meal business was growing faster than any of the national brands wanted to acknowledge. Campbell's response was a strategic retreat from frozen food that would take most of a decade to complete, but whose direction was clear from the early 1990s onward. The company began divesting its frozen food assets, repositioning capital toward its higher margin businesses, and making the kind of portfolio decisions that look rational from a distance and feel like abandonment from the inside. In 1998, Campbell Soup sold the Swanson frozen meal business, including the Hungry Man line, to Vlasic Foods International. Vlasic was a company primarily known for pickles. It had ambitions to build a diversified food portfolio, and the Swanson acquisition was central to that strategy. But Vlasic had taken on significant debt to finance its expansion, and the frozen food business it had purchased required sustained investment in marketing, in product development, in the infrastructure of keeping a national frozen meal brand competitive that the company's balance sheet could not comfortably support. The Swanson brand, which had been underinvested in during the final years of Campbell's ownership, arrived at Vlasic already carrying the accumulated damage of years of cost-cutting and strategic neglect. What Vlasic did with it was not meaningfully different from what Campbell had been doing. The cost pressures that had driven the quiet reformulations of the late 1980s continued under new ownership. The marketing investment that might have refreshed the brand's relevance for a new generation of consumers did not materialize. The Swanson name, which had once been one of the most trusted in American frozen food, was now being managed by a company that was fighting for its own survival. Vlasic filed for bankruptcy in January 2001. The frozen food assets, including Swanson and the Hungry Man line, were acquired out of bankruptcy by Pinnacle Foods, a private equity-backed food company that had been built specifically to acquire and manage distressed consumer food brands. Pinnacle was experienced at this kind of work. It understood how to extract value from legacy brands by rationalizing their portfolios, reducing their cost structures, and maintaining just enough brand presence to keep the products moving through retail channels without the expense of genuine reinvestment. It was under Pinnacle's ownership that the decision was made that would effectively end the Swanson Hungry-Man Breakfast as the product that working American families had known since the late 1970s. Pinnacle held two breakfast-relevant brands simultaneously, Swanson and Aunt Jemima. The Aunt Jemima frozen breakfast line, which Pinnacle had also acquired, was a dedicated breakfast brand with its own consumer recognition and its own product architecture. From a portfolio management standpoint, the logic of consolidation was straightforward. Breakfast products belonged under a breakfast brand. The Swanson name, Pinnacle decided, would be redirected toward the broth and stock business, where it retained strong consumer recognition and higher margins. The frozen breakfast line that had lived under the Swanson Hungry-Man identity would be absorbed into Aunt Jemima's portfolio or discontinued outright. Who exactly was supposed to protect the people who had been buying that red and white box every week for 20 years? The answer, as it turned out, was nobody. Not because the people making the decision were indifferent to consumers, though indifference is not an unfair characterization of how private equity manages legacy food brands, but because the consumer who had been loyal to the Swanson Hungry-Man Breakfast for 2 decades was not present in the Pinnacle Foods boardroom. The factory workers who had spent careers on the production lines were not present. The regional sales reps who had placed the product in those freezer cases store by store were not present. The working mothers and the latchkey kids and the shift workers who had built their mornings around that tray were not present. What was present was a portfolio chart. And on that chart, the Swanson Hungry-Man Breakfast was a low-margin SKU in a category where Pinnacle already had a stronger asset. The math pointed in one direction, and the math won. The people on the front lines felt it before the decision was announced. Regional sales reps began receiving signals from retail buyers that the Swanson breakfast SKUs were being flagged for review. The retail industry's language for a product that is about to lose its shelf allocation. Production scheduling at the manufacturing facilities began to reflect reduced order volumes. Workers on the breakfast line noticed that the runs were getting shorter, that the downtime between production cycles was getting longer, that the quiet administrative language of wind down was appearing in the scheduling memos and the shift assignments. Nobody told the consumers. Nobody told the workers directly. Nobody issued a statement or held a press conference or put a note on the packaging that said, "This is the last run. Buy what you need. We are not coming back." The Swanson Hungry-Man Breakfast did not get a goodbye. It got a portfolio decision. And when the difference between those two things became clear to the people who had depended on it, the product was already gone. The shelf did not go empty all at once. That is the thing about the disappearance of a product that has been in the freezer case for 2 decades. It does not vanish on a single morning with a dramatic announcement and a clear date. It fades, it thins. One week the facing is full. The next week there are 2 boxes where there used to be 6. The week after that there is 1, pushed to the side, slightly frost burned at the corner from being handled and replaced too many times. And then there is nothing, just a gap in the freezer case, a rectangle of bare metal shelf liner where the red and white box used to be, and a different product sliding in from the side to fill it before most shoppers have time to notice what is missing. That is how the Swanson Hungry-Man Breakfast left the American freezer aisle. Not with a press release, not with a final production run announced to loyal customers, not with any of the formal acknowledgement that a product which had fed working American families for the better part of 2 decades might reasonably have deserved. It left the way things leave when the people managing them have already moved on, gradually, quietly, and without looking back. The timing of the full discontinuation corresponds to the period of Pinnacle Foods ownership and portfolio restructuring in the early to mid-2000s, following the Vlasic bankruptcy acquisition. The Swanson brand's frozen meal presence was being systematically redirected toward broth and stock products, where the margins were better and the competitive position was stronger. The breakfast line, already diminished by years of cost-cutting and reformulation under Campbell and Vlasic, did not survive the transition. The shelf space it had held in Kroger and Safeway and Winn-Dixie in A&P, space that Swanson's regional sales teams had negotiated and defended for more than 20 years, was reassigned. The freezer case moved on. For the people who had been buying the product every week, the experience of its disappearance was disorienting in a way that was difficult to explain to anyone who had not lived it. Consider the woman in her mid-40s, somewhere in the Midwest, who had been buying the Swanson Hungry-Man Breakfast since her children were in grade school. She had not thought about the product consciously in years. It was simply part of the weekly grocery run. Freezer section, second case from the end, eye level, red and white box, into the cart. She could have navigated to it in the dark. On the morning she reached for it and found something else in its place, she did not immediately understand what had happened. She checked the adjacent shelves. She looked on the lower rack. She flagged down a stock clerk and asked, and the stock clerk, young, recently hired, with no memory of the product at all, looked at her with genuine incomprehension and said he had never heard of it. That exchange happened in thousands of supermarkets across the country, in slightly different forms, over the course of the months during which the Swanson Hungry-Man Breakfast disappeared from the national freezer case. It happened to shift workers who had stocked the tray as a Sunday night ritual for 15 years. It happened to men in their 50s who had eaten the product before work since Reagan was president. It happened to adults who had grown up eating it as latchkey kids in the 1980s and had carried the habit into their own households without ever examining why. None of them received an explanation. None of them received an alternative recommendation. None of them received anything at all because the mechanism through which a product disappears from a supermarket shelf generates no consumer-facing communication of any kind. A SKU is discontinued. A shelf is reallocated. A different product occupies the space. From the retailer's perspective, the transaction is complete. From the consumer's perspective, something that was part of the structure of daily life has simply ceased to exist. The online record of the product's disappearance is thinner than it would be for a product discontinued after 2005, for a reason that is worth stating plainly. The Swanson Hungry-Man Breakfast left the market before social media existed as a vehicle for consumer grief. There was no Twitter thread the morning the last shipment sold through. There was no Reddit post cataloging the final lot codes. There was no Facebook group, or if there was, it appeared too late and too small to generate the kind of documented fan response that later food discontinuations would produce. The people who lost the product mostly lost it in silence, in individual supermarkets, on individual mornings, without knowing that thousands of other people were having the same experience at the same time. What the historical record does preserve is the shape of the loss. The Hungry Man brand itself survived, redirected by Pinnacle Foods toward frozen dinner entrees, where it continues today under Conagra Brands, which acquired Pinnacle in 2018. The large portion identity that Swanson had built in 1973 lives on in the Hungry Man dinner line. But the breakfast product, the specific thing that had solved the morning for a generation of working American households, did not make the transition. It was not rebranded. It was not reformulated and relaunched. It was simply removed from the portfolio, and the space it had occupied in the freezer case was filled by something that had no memory of what had been there before. The Aunt Jemima frozen breakfast line, which Pinnacle had positioned as the destination for consumers looking for frozen breakfast products, was not the same thing. It was not the same portion size. It was not the same flavor profile. It was not the same brand, and brand in the frozen food aisle is not a trivial distinction. It is the accumulated memory of every morning a household has trusted a product to deliver what it promised. You cannot transfer that memory by moving a consumer from one box to another. You can only hope they find their way to the new product on their own and accept that many of them will not. Many of them did not. They stood in the freezer aisle and looked at what was available and found nothing that felt like the right answer. Some of them tried the Aunt Jemima line and found it acceptable and adapted. Some of them moved to Jimmy Dean products and built a new habit over time. Some of them stopped buying frozen breakfast entirely and found other solutions to the same morning problem. And some of them, a number that cannot be quantified but that shows up consistently in the consumer memory record whenever the subject is raised, simply never found a replacement that felt like what they had lost. They adjusted because people adjust, but they remembered. The freezer case does not remember. That is not what freezer cases are for. The week after the last Swanson Hungry-Man Breakfast sold through at a Kroger in Cincinnati, or a Safeway in Sacramento, or a Winn-Dixie in Birmingham, the shelf was full again. Different product, different packaging, different brand. Full. The store looked the same. The weekly shoppers moved through in the same patterns. The frozen food aisle hummed with the same refrigeration units that had kept the red and white box cold for more than 20 years. Nothing marked the absence. Nothing acknowledged what had been there. The machine that stocked the shelf had no mechanism for grief, no protocol for farewell, no capacity to register that something worth remembering had just quietly stopped being available. The people who remembered had to do it alone.